Can Allah exist without his speech?
Once again, I just said that attributes cannot exist without the essence, so no.
So Allah cannot exist without his speech.
Without his attribute of being able to speak, yeah, he can't exist without it.
Okay. Right. And so is the Quran Allah's speech?
Is the Quran Allah's speech? Yeah, it's part of the speech. It's not the entirety of the attribute of speech of Allah.
In Christianity, the Word of God, Logos, is one and indivisible, having manifested himself in Jesus Christ as the sole, complete, and final revelation of God. In Islamic theology, particularly Sunni theology, Allah is considered simple, not composite, and without parts. However, if the Quran is only a part of the speech of Allah, then this implies that the speech of Allah has distinct parts. If the speech of Allah has parts, then there is a plurality within Allah's attributes, which leads to the possibility of composition within Allah's essence. This contradicts the absolute concept of Tawhid in Islam, as something that has parts cannot be an absolute unity. If the Quran is only a part of the speech of Allah, how can a Muslim be certain that the other parts of the speech of Allah do not contain teachings that differ from or even contradict the Quran? If all parts of the speech of Allah must be consistent with each other, then why did Allah reveal only a portion and not the entirety of it? If there are parts that remain unrevealed, then it is possible that these unrevealed parts modify or correct the Quran, which means the Quran is not truly final.
Okay. So it's part of the attribute of his speech. Is the Quran created?
No, the Quran is uncreated.
The Quran is uncreated. The Quran is uncreated.
Let's understand what uncreated and created means. So when we say that the attributes and the things, the actions that come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are uncreated, we're talking about the existence of these particular things in general. So anything, any action in which God does, they are not dependent upon anything other than himself. When we say words like contingent, dependent, independent, so on and so forth, we're just simply meaning that they do not depend on anything else to exist other than the individual himself, which would be God in this case, right? He doesn't depend on, for example, you or I to exist in order for his attribute of speech or the result of the attribute of speech to exist.
Okay. So the Quran has never come into existence. It has always existed, correct?
What does that mean? Like, are you saying that the Quran didn't come into, for example, our world, or are you talking?
No. I mean, like, there was never a point where the Quran did not exist.
Okay, so in terms of his knowledge, no, it's always existed. And in terms of the speech, I'm getting there, relax. Okay. And by the way, I didn't know that this was a Q&A session, but we'll go through it.
We're just talking. We're just talking about Tawhid.
Yeah, no problem. So in terms of the Quran, this is something that has always existed within the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In terms of the attribute of speech, obviously it's something that was brought forward towards his creation in order for us to also be able to acknowledge it.
So respectfully, that's not what I'm asking. So is Allah's knowledge distinct from his speech?
Is Allah's knowledge distinct from his speech? Yeah, sure. But in terms of, let me finish. Okay. So in terms of specific attributes of Allah, such as speech, such as knowledge, so on and so forth, there are particular attributes that do come into play together. For example, his speech and his knowledge. Without his knowledge, there would be no coherent speech, right? All of them have to come together in order to formulate particular things, which Allah does with intention, right? No
worries. But as soon as I'm glad though that you acknowledge that there is a distinction between Allah's speech and Allah's knowledge. They're not the same thing. Right. So if they're not the same thing, and we can get past that, which is good. So the Quran, you said, is part of Allah's speech, right?
All right. It's from his speech. We wouldn't say necessarily part, but go ahead. If I said
part, that's what you said. I'm going with you. You said it's part of Allah's speech.
So I took it back. Hold on. I retracted it. If I said speech, I specifically said I retracted it. Go ahead. Don't build off of a false argument.
Oh, yeah. I don't want to. I want to make sure we represent you correctly. So I'll ask you again. Is the Quran Allah's speech?
Yeah, it's from his speech. I didn't say it is his speech. Is the Quran Allah's speech? Yeah, it's part of the speech. Is
it his speech or not?
I just said it is not the entirety of Allah's speech.
If the Quran originates from the speech of Allah but is not a part of it, then there is an ontological distinction between the Quran and the speech of Allah. This means that the Quran is not the speech of Allah itself, but rather something that is derived from the speech of Allah. However, Sunni Islamic doctrine asserts that the Quran is not created, ghayr makhluk. If the Quran is not created but also not a part of the speech of Allah, then its ontological status becomes unclear. In logical terms, if something is neither included in the whole nor a part of that whole, then it does not belong to that entity at all. For example, if I say, this water comes from the river, but it is not part of the river, nor is it the entire river, I have created confusion because the water must fall into one of these categories. Similarly, if the Quran is neither a part of the speech of Allah nor its entirety, then the Quran cannot be considered the speech of Allah at all. How can something originate from the speech of Allah but not be a part of it? If the Quran cannot be categorized as a part of the speech of Allah but is still considered the speech of Allah, then two distinct entities exist. One, the absolute speech of Allah, whose full content is unknown. Two, the Quran, which is not a part of the speech of Allah, but is still called the speech of Allah. This leads to the existence of two separate entities with divine attributes, which contradicts the concept of Tawhid, which emphasizes the absolute oneness of Allah. This Muslim is caught in a major contradiction. If he insists that the Quran is the speech of Allah but is neither a part of it nor its entirety, then he must accept one of the following two possibilities. One, the Quran is created, which contradicts Sunni Islamic doctrine. Two, there is plurality within Allah's divine attributes, which contradicts the concept of Tawhid. She must choose one because if not, her concept collapses and becomes illogical.
So it's part of his speech.
Never said part.
I'm asking.
I said no.
So, okay. So if it's not part of his speech, then it is his speech, right?
We say part. Okay. So the real understanding in terms of why we don't say part is because specifically when you say part, it means that there's a limit to something or that it is a chunk of it and so on and so forth, right?
Exactly.
We're not to say that there's a limit to Allah's speech first and foremost, because it's something that we continue on and on, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not something that ends. We would say that it's from the speech, from the knowledge of God.
Okay, again. So if it's from his speech, the Quran is from his speech, then it is his speech, right? Now, when you say, wait, hold on, let me just preface it. I'm sorry. Let me just preface it. Wait, Atachi, please. I listen to you. Atachi, hold on a second. Hold on.
No, because you're cutting me off in the middle.
No, I don't mean to. I'm sorry. I know. Let me just.
Yeah. So let me finish.
Wait, please. I'm respectfully.
Okay. So go ahead. Build off a false point. Go ahead.
Well, yeah. I'm not building off a false point. I'm just building off what you said.
Go ahead.
When you say, because you said this, that the Quran is not the entirety of Allah's speech. That literally means that the Quran then is part or a chunk of Allah's speech by default.
So we're not gonna we don't have to deflect or desist towards the way that you want to clarify a particular point, right? So if I say it's from it, then I would ask you to acknowledge the terminology that I use.
I am. That's why I'm asking you.
That's why I said from. That's why I didn't say
is the Quran.
I said from.
So okay, I'll ask again. When you said that the Quran is not entirely Allah's speech, right?
That's why I said it's from it for the fifth time.
Right. So when you say that it's not entirely Allah's speech, that means it is some of Allah's speech, correct?
It is
not all of it.
Speech. I never said it's some of it. I never said it's part of it. I never said it's a chunk of it. That's clearly words that I did not use. So you can keep asking the same question 10 times or move on to the next one.
No, Atachi. Here's the thing, and I think that this is where you kind of got yourself in trouble, is with your terminology by using words like entirely automatically by default mean that, okay, it is some of or a part of. When you say entire, it's not not the entirety of his speech. That means it is some of his speech or part of his speech, but not in full.
Sure. Let's go with that. Go ahead.
Let's go with that?
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So the Quran is part of Allah's speech. So Allah's speech then has components to it. It can be divided in a way.
Okay, the speech, the attribute of speech, or are you talking about the contents?
Allah's speech. We're talking about Allah's
No, the
speech.
speech, no. The contents, sure.
If the Quran is the content of the speech of Allah, then there is a distinction between speech and its content. In the concept of language, content, the message, cannot be separated from the act of speaking itself. If the Quran is merely the content of the speech of Allah, then what differentiates speech from its content? This implies the existence of two distinct realities. One, the speech of Allah as an entity. Two, the Quran as its content. But if the Quran is not part of the speech, then how can it still be called the speech of Allah? If the Quran is merely one part of the content of the speech of Allah, does that mean there are other parts of His speech that remain unrevealed? If there are, then the Quran is not the only final revelation, contradicting Islamic claims. If there are no other contents, then what is the purpose of saying that the Quran is merely the content of the speech of Allah? If the Quran is only the content of the speech, then the speech of Allah could exist without the Quran. This raises two possibilities. One, the Quran is created because something that can exist or not exist is not eternal. Two, Allah has speech without content, which is illogical because speech without content is meaningless. If the Quran is merely the content of the speech of Allah, and that content can change or be updated, then the Quran is not eternal. However, Sunni doctrine asserts that the Quran is Ghair Makhluk, not created. If the Quran is only content, then there could be a higher content, contradicting the doctrine of final revelation. This Muslim is now caught in a contradiction. One, if the Quran is the content of the speech of Allah, then there is something greater than the Quran, undermining the concept of final revelation. Two, if the Quran can be separated from the speech of Allah, then the Quran is not eternal, contradicting Sunni doctrine. Three, if the Quran is not an attribute but merely content, then Allah can have speech without content, which is illogical.